In the spring of 1933, the United States government declared that private gold ownership was illegal. Overnight, a form of money that Americans had carried, saved, and trusted for generations was reclassified as contraband. Citizens were ordered to surrender their gold within 26 days at a fixed price set by the state under threat of severe criminal penalties. On paper, the order appeared absolute, sweeping, and final. Yet nearly a century later, the historical record reveals something deeply inconsistent with that image. Despite the unprecedented authority claimed by the government, most privately held gold was never surrendered. The official narrative portrays mass compliance, civic duty, and orderly submission during a national emergency. The underlying record points in the opposite direction: concealment, quiet defiance, and widespread non-participation on a scale rarely acknowledged. Between 75% and 80% of privately held gold remained outside government hands. Millions of ordinary Americans retained their coins, bars, and certificates without raids, mass arrests, or systematic enforcement. Only a tiny number of prosecutions occurred nationwide, and almost all involved institutions or individuals who interacted directly with the formal financial system. The image of aggressive searches, sealed safe deposit boxes, and door-to-door enforcement belongs to legend rather than documented fact. This gap between legal authority and practical outcome defines the central phenomenon. A federal crime was declared, penalties were broadcast, and patriotic compliance was publicly encouraged. Yet the overwhelming majority of gold owners were never detected, never charged, and never compelled to comply. The event commonly remembered as a successful confiscation was, in functional terms, a partial and uneven exercise of control. Understanding why this happened requires moving past the surface story. The outcome was not accidental, nor was it driven primarily by public morality or fear. It reflected structural limits on enforcement, constraints within the monetary system itself, and a narrow set of targets the government was actually capable of reaching. The events of 1933 cannot be understood as a moral campaign against hoarding or a punitive action against disobedient citizens. The confiscation order emerged from a narrowly defined monetary emergency. By April 1933, the United States was operating under an irreconcilable constraint. Every dollar in circulation remained legally redeemable for gold, while gold itself was rapidly disappearing from the system. The economic context was severe. The Great Depression had entered its fourth year. Approximately 15 million Americans were unemployed. More than 9,000 banks had failed. In March, the president ordered a nationwide bank closure, halting all withdrawals and deposits. When banks reopened weeks later, deposits unexpectedly flowed back in, temporarily stabilizing confidence. Yet beneath that surface calm, the monetary foundation remained unstable. Gold reserves at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had fallen below the legal minimum required to support paper currency issuance. Foreign creditors increasingly demanded settlement in metal rather than dollars. Domestically, citizens began withdrawing gold coins instead of spending them, converting circulating currency into hoarded reserves. Each redemption reduced the system's ability to function. The gold standard, not public psychology, was the binding constraint. The government's objective was not to punish private ownership itself, but to remove gold from private hands in order to regain control over monetary policy. Currency devaluation was already planned. However, as long as citizens retained the legal right to exchange dollars for gold at the existing rate of $20.67 per ounce, devaluation was impossible. Gold had to be centralized first. The confiscation order was therefore a prerequisite, not the end goal. 9 months later, this logic became explicit. In January 1934, the Gold Reserve Act redefined gold's official value at $35 per ounce. Gold, surrendered by citizens at the earlier rate, instantly increased in book value by nearly $3 billion. Those who had complied effectively transferred purchasing power to the state. The sequence reveals intent: compulsory acquisition followed by revaluation. Despite the severity of the language, enforcement capacity was structurally limited. The government lacked a practical mechanism to locate gold held privately in homes, farms, or rural properties. No national registry of gold ownership existed. The financial infrastructure of the era concentrated gold primarily within banks, corporations, and Federal Reserve member institutions. These entities were visible, regulated, and already under government control. They became the primary source of surrendered gold. The threat of punishment was real, but selectively applicable. Approximately 20 prosecutions occurred nationwide, almost all involving institutional custody, commercial transactions, or attempts to move large quantities through the financial system. One widely cited case involved a Wall Street attorney whose bullion was held at a major bank and therefore fully visible to authorities. By contrast, no documented cases originated from private rural households or small-scale personal holdings. Legal exemptions further narrowed enforcement reach. Individuals were permitted to retain up to $100 in gold coin, allowing families to distribute holdings across members. Gold, classified as having numismatic value, was exempt without clear statutory definition, leaving enforcement discretion ambiguous. Foreign-held gold lay outside the order's jurisdiction entirely. These gaps were not peripheral. They defined the practical boundaries of state power. The confiscation succeeded only where visibility existed. Banks, corporations, and custodial institutions surrendered gold because they could not conceal it and could not refuse. Private individuals who avoided institutional channels faced little realistic risk. Silence, physical possession, and absence from the financial system proved sufficient. The outcome was therefore shaped less by obedience or resistance than by structural asymmetry. The government could declare authority broadly, but it could only enforce narrowly. The confiscation order functioned as a tool to restructure the monetary system, not as a comprehensive seizure of private wealth. Its apparent reach exceeded its actual capacity. The immediate consequence of the 1,933 gold confiscation was not universal loss, but a redistribution shaped by visibility. Gold, held within the banking system, corporate balance sheets, and regulated institutions, was absorbed into state control and revalued upward. Gold held privately, physically, and outside formal channels largely survived. The dividing line was not legality in theory, but reachability in practice. This outcome altered the balance of power within the monetary system. By centralizing institutional gold, the government removed the constraint that had prevented currency devaluation. The dollar was decoupled from its previous limitation, allowing policy flexibility that had been impossible under full convertibility. Monetary authority shifted decisively away from private redemption rights toward centralized management. Those who complied financed this transition indirectly through lost purchasing power, while those who remained outside the system avoided that transfer. Behavioral norms shifted as well. Trust in institutional custody weakened, particularly among populations that had already experienced bank failures and closures. The episode reinforced a practical lesson. Assets visible to the system were assets subject to reclassification, repricing, and control. Assets held privately were governed by a different reality. This distinction persisted long after gold ownership was re-legalized in 1974. The longer-term legacy extended beyond the United States. Subsequent attempts at gold control in other countries followed similar patterns, producing compliance on paper and circumvention in practice. Where confiscation depended on institutional intermediaries, it succeeded. Where it confronted dispersed private ownership, it failed. Over time, legal frameworks evolved to reflect these limits. Emergency powers were narrowed, constitutional protections strengthened, and outright seizure became increasingly impractical under peacetime conditions. What remained constant was the underlying principle revealed by the historical record. Enforcement required visibility, and visibility was not automatic. It was produced by custody choices, reporting structures, and institutional participation. The gold that changed hands was the gold that could be seen. The gold that endured was the gold that remained outside formal reach. That distinction did not disappear with changing laws or technologies. It merely changed form. Understanding where assets sit within that divide remains essential for understanding how power is exercised in moments of financial stress.